these remarks are called on being overwhelmed, because the theme that has been in the last two discussions developed, that is the psychologically real, stands in fragility, one might say, stands in danger, and so that this particular discussion lies in between the attempt to delineate some of the features of the psychologically real on the one hand, and then the next two discussions, the ones that follow this, the purpose of which will be to describe what I know, or think is known, about the means of releasing, contacting, supporting the psychologically real, both in situations which are extremely tenuous in the next lecture, and then those which are much more familiar around the theme of repetitions, blocked actions that get repeated. Now, just in brief summary, what I've been arguing here is that the most essential feature of psychological work turns around a recognition of the individuality of perspectives and an acceptance of their natural development, you might say, both their neurological and environmental history. And that the work begins in an appreciation of the uniqueness, complexity, and independence, separateness of human perspectives. And you heard me talking about a good deal about the special conditions of work of one perspective with another, especially very difficult perspectives like paranoid megalomaniac perspectives, or the general sensitivity of human perspectives in general. Now, out of that discussion, there emerged, as usual, I suppose, an opposite theme. The opposite theme being that the perspectives are not all there is. Most notably, there is something that's been called for a very long time reality, upon which the perspectives look or are formed by. And from the collision or joint discussion of the concept of the psychological and the problem of reality, there emerges this term, psychological reality, which is a deliberate oxymoron, and that is a deliberately internally contradictory statement, because the psychological, by definition, refers to what we are able to, our perception of the world, as opposed to the world. So when we speak of a psychological reality, we jump back and forth between two disparate ideas. But I stick with that sort of push me, pull you term, because it suggests, to me at least, it suggests that the psychological has to open itself to the real. The psychological has to question its relationship to the real. The psychological has to constantly check itself against other perspectives, but approach this with humility, which is called for by the narrowness of its perspective. Now, to suggest that there is a world out there that our own views do not fully encompass is, of course, ridiculously obvious. And sometimes, of course, in life we are told that the storm is coming. We are warned about its size, direction, impact, coming out of doors. But those are the relatively happy events, since expectation discounts the great enemy of human comfort, which is surprise, and allows people to prepare, or at least to know they are unprepared. But of course, reality forces itself on perspectives in much more disquieting ways when the thing we least expect, as the expression is, falls our way. It's also true that reality appears to us from within, that is, within ourselves. We find out things about ourselves we did not know, as we like to say. Sometimes these are happy things. One hears in our business, of course, particularly more about unhappy discoveries. Now we make this separation between external reality and the reality within us only because we are in the middle, so to speak, between the world and ourselves. But in fact, ourselves are part of the world, and the world is part of ourselves, etc. But this difficulty of conjoining the concept of perspective with internal and external reality is compounded by the fact that we really are midway in this spectacle of our bounded lives. And when I came to try to, as I was doing for the last couple of discussions, to try to find recognition points for psychological reality, that is, I addressed the typically clinical task of not simply talking about things, but knowing when they're happening, and even, hopefully, perhaps a tiny bit controlling them. I then set myself the notion of not only trying to identify what might be beyond our perspective of the world at large, but above all, since the part of the world we address ourselves to in psychotherapy is notably the person with us or the person before us, to wonder how the reality of that individual would be known to us. And I introduced this discussion, you recall, perhaps by saying that we have a feeling sometimes that there is a person before us, or we have a feeling there is not anyone before us. There is no one home, as the expression is. And many states in between those two vague notions. We also, I mentioned that once upon a time, psychopathic people were said to be notable for being absent, that the imposter visage replaced reality. And I remarked that in the course of the study of people charged with being imposters, on the whole that had not proved to be the case at all. In fact, a kind of simple childlike reality seemed to emerge from the contact with people who were called psychopathic often. And I mention that particularly because I want to contrast it with what seems to me the meaning of soulfulness, which is a term I think of as synonymous with human psychological reality. And soulfulness has the particular trait, if I understand it, especially soulfulness as it expresses itself in music, has the particular trait of contradicting itself, so that the singer sings of love, but love lost, or love regained and lost again, or all the complexities of human feelings and reflections. I didn't mention in discussing that something that I perhaps should have, which is that the students of hysteria early on distinguished so-called good and bad hysteria, primitive and adult hysteria. But in speaking of the good or adult hysteria, they remarked that there was an observable that allowed you to identify the presence of that often, and that was the patient's capacity to correct themselves. And those of you who have had the good fortune of knowing many people who fall within this group, giving it thereby perhaps too sharp a distinctness, but in any case, people that remind us of this concept will often have that experience of hearing the hysterical person talk at one point with great passion, hyperbole, typically, exaggeration, But then if you listen a little bit later, you'll hear it corrected. It falls back upon itself. And so you are given the notion that this mind has within itself two poles which correct each other. And of course the developmentalists in psychoanalysis were very quick to relate that to what was thought to be the lucky break that had happened to hysterical people that drew them up into the so-called Oedipal problem. That is, that they had two parents, both of whom were internalized to some extent. So it was as if there were two voices in their head, each correcting each other. And any student of domestic life will know that that's not an improbability. Each parent, to some extent correcting, hopefully, the insanity of the other. But again, you see my point, that again we're talking about a feature of psychological experience which is marked by internal contradiction and correction. I went on in the last discussions, in the most recent discussions, to talk about these statements that were made about Mozart's music, several of which were, you recall, the recognition in this music of these diverse and contradictory strains that gave it what do you say? It gave it a truthfulness, emotional reality, but also a complexity that people would over and over again call human, or if not call human, since most of us fall short of that, but what we would like to experience and would like to contain in terms of human being. And with that note, something has happened to the concept of reality, which is, if not shattering, it is disturbing, although it may end up, as we think about it, being enlightening and encouraging. That is, reality proves to be, fragile. As it proves to be an ideal more than a commonplace. And so we have this. We're left with this curious situation in which we're talking about something which seems to be all around us and central to everything, which is nevertheless not present. I don't think that we would be quite able to encompass, at least I would not be able to quite encompass that, if it weren't really very familiar, i.e., that this was said about God, for example. That he was everywhere but nowhere, all-knowing but unknown. And the same thing is a feature of the descriptions of science, scientific work. That is that the hypothesis aims at, the experiment, which gives us back a result which suggests or doesn't suggest the hypothesis. But out of sight of this experimental procedure is a reality which continues to throw up baffling questions. And some of the most astute critics of science, of course, have claimed, like Sir Karl Popper, the distinguished Sir Karl Popper, who says that a hypothesis can only be disproved; it can never be proved. So there again, the elusiveness of reality should make us not surprised that psychologically too we find ourselves with more an ideal than an everyday reality. So this discussion today stands between these hints as to what is for us as a human ideal, on the one hand, and then the means by which we might cultivate it, lose it, perhaps today particularly, the discussion of being overwhelmed and losing it, and also then recovering it, and how we go about the business at hand. So there's a forlornness in this announcement, certainly, because for lectures supposedly on psychotherapy, I'm getting around to treatment as a distinct enterprise, pretty late, and maybe not very much even then. There may be some wisdom in that. Now, on being overwhelmed, I want to address from two obvious directions. One therapists overwhelming patients and patients overwhelming therapists. How does the real get lost in the therapeutic encounter? And I want to sketch now several classes of examples under each of those headings: therapists overwhelming patients and patients overwhelming therapists. Now, all along I have been saying, and this is only a repetition again, all along I've been saying that one of the great enemies of the real is the cliche, is the name, is the announcement, the categorization, which, however much it may organize our observations and order our world, puts us in danger of missing the person named. And I mean, I could bore you, and I think you probably wouldn't be here if you didn't agree with me anyway about this. So it's, so I probably don't need to say anything at all. But this, of course, is the plague of present times. We did go through a period in psychotherapeutic work under the influence of psychoanalysis when there was a genuine sense of search, and people could say, paraphrasing Freud, that the diagnosis was only arrived at after the treatment was completed. And since the treatment was interminable, perhaps the diagnosis never arrived at. And those things were said and meant and thought about and understood. But nothing could be further from the climate of the present moment, when names are attached to people, ever-increasing numbers of names. If you think you've got the old name straight, I've just got in the mail yesterday an announcement that DSM-4 preliminary version is about to appear for our comments. I think most of our comments might, good luck or God damn or something. Anyway, it's coming like the snowfall. And so that doesn't need my worrying at like an old bone really any further. This closing down around names. But I want to repeat what I hope I say, that I'm not simply an enemy of names. Names are inevitable. Names are just the way we emotionally respond to things, even before we try to classify and experiment and collect data. It's a name. And I've mentioned much earlier in these discussions that marvelous book, Language and Myth, by Ernst Cassirer, where Cassirer suggests that language in general rose out of the first great name, that when so-called primitive man, I think there's competition for that title, but he means very early man, when primitive man was faced by the waterfall or the snowstorm or the earthquake or the falling star, he called out, God, the way we still do, right? Oh God. Right? Present generation has substituted the word shit for a lot of that, in keeping with the widespread disillusionment about God and life. But in any case, that this naming is intrinsic to the reaction to life. And I suspect that the old-fashioned idea that the name is an effort to encompass it, to contain it, to somehow not be overwhelmed by it, that has some sense to it. And in the course of these discussions, as again you probably remember more often, more repetitively than you'd like, I suggested that there's a kind of fundamental biological process here in which we deposit in each other's spaces emotional vesicles or discharges which act upon us and cause interaction between us. And here is a very famous example, isn't it, of where the world suddenly enters our little neurological space with a thunderous announcement of catastrophe or wonderment, which calls up our little response, right? Our, oh God. So this naming is not something we'll abolish, or we want to, but we have to realize, how, in a very large sense, how defensive, reflexive, containing it means to be. But the dangers of therapists overwhelming patients, of course, don't stop there. And I think the second, in my crude glossary of these differences, and difficulties. I think the second largest problem that therapists bring to patients, in a moment I'll say the same thing that patients bring to therapists, is the problem of power. And one of the things that I have grown to feel over a good many years now was one of the principal things missing from my education in this work, was an acknowledgement of the differences in people's power. Freud, very early, for example, threw down his arms before that problem. He called it the economic problem, in part. And he said he didn't know how to measure it, and he didn't have any means to measure it. But it was typical of his candor and honesty that he would say that he would throw down his arms, openly. Nevertheless, the differences in people's power in situations can be very great and can be overwhelming. I have a semi-secret sort of Marxist explanation of the silence around this issue. And this may seem to you naive or paranoid, and perhaps it's both. That is, that I think the silence about the differences in power is an important silence to be kept, because those people in power would not like us to realize how powerless we are. Now, it certainly is no secret. The history of Marxism and of many other movements in modern times, or Nietzsche's strange inversion of the power problem in some respects, all examples of the fact this is nothing new. But I am struck by how quiet that issue is in our own business. I love to tell, and perhaps already told here, the story of my father's meeting Douglas MacArthur, and he was one of a group of lawyers that the general wanted some advice from about some arcane matter, and they were all assembled in his suite in the Waldorf Towers many years ago now. And these were independent men, and my father prided himself on not licking anybody's boots, and for the most part didn't, as far as I could tell. But when my father came back from this meeting, he told me how astonished he really was. He had never met anything like this, he said. I think he told me in part it was a generosity to tell me, because in a sense he was talking about saying something about his own powerlessness. He said that if at the end of the discussion General MacArthur had said to this assembled group of lawyers, "Go to the window and jump out," they would all have done so. Now, you could say, well, that's ridiculous. How do you know? They would have. And of course we don't. Martin Orne, now somewhat mixed character, known for the Sexton thing, that Martin Orne, the hypnosis researcher, though, is somebody who has taught us that patients, subjects, people do an awful lot of things as long as they know you don't mean it. And that an awful lot of experiments on punishment are really not good experiments, because the subject is caught on that this isn't for real. Now, how do I know it was for real? And how did my father think it was for real? He would, in fact, open the sash of the window and plunge, 35 stories to the bottom of the Waldorf Astoria. But there's one fact, however, which gives this claim, it seems to me, some genuine hold on us, and that is that if you're a general, that's exactly what you have to do. If you can't do it, you're not a general very long. You have to go up to poor suckers like us and say, "Hey, there's a hill over there. Take it," And and he knows, from time immemorial, everyone has known, that meant that you may be dead. Indeed, he may say to you, "Give your life for your country," i.e. me, And it's unnecessary at any time to remind you that these people have been doing this in response to these requests, from time immemorial. And great commanders were my heroes growing up in books and schools, and they had all done this. They all had this extraordinary power.
Nowadays, of course, MacArthur was really a kind of a splendid example of how much better it is to be a general now than it used to be. You still have the privilege of sending other people in, but you don't expose yourself much anymore. Although he was famous in World War I for at least being seen briefly, I expect, in the front lines. But in the old days, Alexander the Great, you remember, was right there in with the soldiers. And so when he said, go get him, he said, not you go get him, he said, let's go get him. And Henry V is full of that splendor. But no more. Nowadays, in fact, I don't know whether you know the marvelous, extraordinary stories of the great moment in the German-Russian campaign when the German General Staff told Adolf Hitler that they would simply insist upon withdrawing from Moscow. And he fired every one of them and took command of the German army on a front of over 1,000 miles himself. Was apparently awake for 5 or 6 days without ever sleeping on the phone. And because Hitler had an extraordinary memory, I don't forget the details. Alan Kirby wrote a wonderful book about this called Barbarossa. And apparently he had in his head the names of the commanders. I forget down to what level. I don't know, it was battalion level. It was coming. I mean, thousands of names. And so here, you and I again, the poor suckers, right? Somewhere around Stalingrad, and the phone rings, right? You don't have an answering machine now. The phone rings, and you pick it up, and who is there? It's Adolfo, your Fuhrer. And he says to you, do not retreat. And my God, that was a voice you listened to. So all this feeling that my father had is not far off, I think. Now, but this difference in power is an everyday event too. I think one of the great unasked questions in feminism, for example, because feminism has mostly addressed power through cultural stereotypes and empowerments of groups. But there is also the intrinsic fact of power, which is acknowledged in feminism in terms of muscular strength, men versus women. But there is also the whole issue of will, because some very small, very weak people, notably Hitler, Napoleon was a tiny man, had power that could literally stop people in their tracks. Some of you may know that story about what happened to the burglars of Sigmund Freud. You know the story of the burglars of Sigmund Freud, right? They came into his apartment in Vienna, and he was recovering or going into or something, one of his innumerable mouth operations. He was in the bedroom, and he came out, undeterred by his pain and the rest of it. He looked them in the eye, and told them, "Get out!" And they all fled. Now, you and I might not be able to do that. He did that. And of course, that's hardly surprising. This man who was not only of enormous intellectual power, but managed to, by his political willpower, seed his ideas everywhere. And one of the things that's extraordinary about Freud is that he was both the inventor and the agent. Darwin was the inventor, but Huxley was more the agent. And there are a few examples of intellectual power also containing political power. Anyway, so those differences have to interest us, and they have to interest us on the plane of self-knowledge. The only person I have ever read who claimed that the most important thing a psychotherapist ought to know is his impact on other people. The only person I ever know said that was Harry Stack Sullivan. And of course, nothing could be more appropriate for an interpersonal psychiatrist than to be concerned about power. And he was. And he asked us to ask ourselves what our impacts were, not just of power, but of other things as well, of course. Now, this question is, of course, immensely subtle, because
our powers differ depending upon the object of our powers. And one of the advantages of having been around the same community for the number of years I have is that you can watch people married to different people. You can watch the fate of humans when in close human contact with different humans. And it's hard to take a good reading, without quite a long observation. But one of the things that has impressed me is how remarkably different some people are if married to a different person. I know someone, a woman, for example, who is capable of empowering men in a way that turned one rather good-hearted, beer-drinking, TV-watching fellow I knew into a almost demon of commercial success. Sleepless, energetic, devoted, successful, all those things. And well, that's nothing new. I mean, what do they say? Behind every man is there's all those sayings, and there's some truth to that. We had it just across the way in the Cambridge Hospital. She's still around. You can see her in Harvard Square now and then. A young woman who was very small, very blonde, very blue-eyed, not quite winsome, but close to it, who had the power of empowering her keepers in a way that was absolutely extraordinary. She could take a sort of frightened resident or a medical student or a mental health worker or a social worker and turn them into a demon of confidence. People who had never felt they'd had a clear idea in their lives suddenly felt like everything was crystalline in front of them. And people whose formulations were famous for a kind of chaotic randomness, would suddenly present, competition with Freud for the clarity, definiteness, and fullness of the whole majestic apparatus. And I don't exaggerate; it was quite extraordinary. And so this capacity to empower renders, these judgments of human power very, very unstable. If we ask ourselves, how could this young woman do it? What was it that she did? I think we come back to the first point I've made under overwhelming. That is, come back to the idea that naming and categorizing is an empowering act. I mean, when I give you a class name by race or sex or size or intelligence, when I do that, I empower myself, for example, to abuse you or to feel superior to you. Proust says somewhere that speaks of the peculiar optics of social perception. Do you know that passage? The peculiar optics of social perception, by which everything that you see is inferior to what you have. Now, I think that's true among so-called normal people. We mental health types, I think, often have a reverse optics, in which things that other people have may seem superior to ours, which is a sign of a more depressive cast of mind. But the average robust, once not twice born individual is very likely to use the Proustian optics to convince himself or herself that she's obviously got it. And all of us do that, of course, even when we're depressed. But I think what happened was that the mental health worker, for example, or the psychiatrist, or myself, she had the same impact on me. What we did was to see her as a willing, adoring object, eager for our command, our knowledge, our clarity. She had the capacity instantly to dub you, General MacArthur, a kind of performative of grace that she could distribute very rapidly. this needs to be, in my opinion, considered next to the phenomenon that, again, I've talked about ad nauseum, the phenomenon that Marilyn Monroe was such a mistress of. That is the capacity to act in such a way that she fulfilled the imaginative longings of people around her. They didn't have to tell her how they wanted her to act. She knew what their imaginative wishes toward her were. And this was not simply a matter of sort of lying down, and being taken advantage of by men. It was much more elaborate than that. It played out the whole range of men's fantasies. And so that she could empower them to feel that they possessed her, or they wanted to possess her, and that she became a kind of living dream, a realization, as Cézanne would have said, a realization of the motifs that she put in their minds. And when you ask yourself, how could such different people as Joe DiMaggio and Arthur Miller, for example, not to mention a couple of others, marry her? You have to, here there has to be a plastic element that appeals to a broad imaginative possibilities in people in general, it seems to me. Well, I at least could go on perhaps too long about this whole subject of therapists overwhelming patients, but the heart of what I'm urging really is that we keep in mind the power of people, what they're doing to us, what we're doing to them, and that above all that we seek to balance power. Now this brings me to a theme which I've been trying to sound in various forms all along. That is the concept of respect, mutual respect. Because generally, as I hear people talk about respect, they talk about my respecting you, or you respecting me. And that's half the story, but it's not often the most important half. It's equally important that I respect myself in your presence, so I don't get overwhelmed too much. And that you respect yourself in my presence, because you can't count on my respect. You can't, because these things that go on between people, of which the case example and Marilyn Monroe are only, special examples, these things are very common and very hard to avoid. So mutual respect in its largest sense, I think, means that I respect myself also, and I protect myself. I feel this is a very important thing to emphasize at the present moment, because this generation, your generation more than mine, has been criticized as being narcissistic, the me generation, the yuppie generation, and nowadays the women's movement and many other movements are attacked because they tend to stereotype things, and they tend to call everybody an abuser, and those things are probably mistaken. But I think those mistakes spring out of a very healthy thing. That is, they spring out of a desire of these groups to protect themselves, to make everybody aware of the danger, even if it sometimes is not quite on target. Make everybody aware. And that's a way of saying, look, I don't just want to respect you, I want to make sure that I'm respected as well. And that seems to me very sensible, and a broad, big step toward a real mutual respect in which we also lay aside some of the stereotypes as well. Now the other side of it of patients overwhelming therapists is of course also a problem in the preservation of the real, because many patients have more power than we do, and they may get their power through their looks, their money, their prestige, the VIP syndrome, which is plagues all hospitals who can't really keep their balance in the presence of famous people. I heard a story yesterday which I enjoyed in that connection. I was talking to one of the old hands at McLean, and he was telling a story about Sher Fraser, whose strengths have been forgotten, unfortunately, at this time when his weaknesses have been exposed. But there was a United States senator was once hospitalized at McLean, and there was a great flurry of Secret Service people and everything wanting to take charge of the wards, essentially, and the treatment. to protect this man. And it was, the story was told in support of Sheriff Frazier, because there was a meeting of these people at which he was present, and he is supposed to have begun it by, or at least in the course of it, saying to them, "Do you people think this is the first senator we've had here?" Well, I thought that was very nice, that to keep the balance of power in a situation like that. When the person came, in this case the senator, with his own retinue, wasn't it, of people to upset everyone. But I think the two most famous examples, the two most repeated and upsetting examples of unbalanced power that stem from patience power are not those relatively infrequent experiences of very important people, but of number one, the borderline patient. Because in my experience of this concept, which is, God knows, a great deal of clarity has been sought for it, and sometimes has been achieved by it. But what I feel is often the critical element is the greater power of the borderline patient than we have. And also, and this is the hardest part to swallow, is often the greater clarity of mind. That many of these people are in fact very clever, very smart, and very strong. And also, of course, very attractive. And what happens is that they come to us, and we are at first very devoted to them. And then something happens, maybe we get frightened, and we withdraw some. Now, that isn't the way it's described in the books. It's more described in the books that everything's going along fine, and then they change. But in my experience of consultation on these, and my own experience with patients, it often is that we have changed first. And they have found that we realized we were getting in over our necks, or over our heads. And we got frightened and drew back. And they began to attack our inconsistency. Now, lots of people attack our inconsistency. But if you've got power and you begin to do it, then you've got a frightened therapist. And frightened therapists, overwhelmed therapists are very common in this situation. For me, one of the experiences that lends some support to this conception of the borderline syndrome being a significant part of a power imbalance problem has been that when Doris Menzer-Benarin, whom some of you knew, was alive, I had the repeated experience of having occasion to send her so-called impossible borderlines, and this didn't happen just once. This happened any number of times. I mean, I can think of 4 or 5 offhand. I'm sure there were more, and I'm just talking about my experience. But what would happen was very interesting. The patient would come with a list of previous therapists as long as your arm, right? And all kinds of hospitalizations and suicide attempts and resignations and horrors of all kind of other. And after one interview, or maybe 2, the patient would be back at work, there would be no sign of any of this, and it would all have disappeared. And, you'd say, well, what the hell is going on? This is impossible. But I think what happened was that the patients knew that they had met their match. That this was someone who was very fond of them, liked them very much, but that was just not going to take any foolishness from anybody. And she did it in such a benign way that she contained the problem as well as alerted them to it. Now that may not be correct. Maybe it was a seduction. Maybe it was a function of her extraordinary ability to find common ground with people and to talk about it, to talk about the weather or the Red Sox or anything, so long as she had a common ground between the person, which made it possible for her to work with very psychotic people. Now, Doris was extraordinary. She was exceptional. I never knew anyone else who could do this to the same degree, although I've heard in other places of occasional people of this kind. But all of us who have been overwhelmed by such patients, and I'm sure that none of us who haven't, except perhaps that even she may have been sometimes, all of us who have been overwhelmed by these situations can be as astonished as I was to find that this really seemed to be repeatedly the case. Well, none of that is compelling evidence for my conviction, but there's another group of patients that are not called borderline, but who come to us also in acute situations, which also make me think that this power problem is a common one. And that is the group of people that are very successful human beings, but who, and it's a little, and quite manipulative, and whose manipulations collapse, and then they come to us. And usually they don't stay very long. They don't stay very long at all. But I, in the course of my work, have had, every now and then someone like this. They don't, as I said, they don't stay very long. But sitting with them is an experience of power. And I've come to be able to sometimes to surprise myself by sort of foretelling what's going to happen on the basis of just simply that experience of being in the presence of power. I guess it was a little like what my father's experience was with MacArthur. And I don't, it's fun to try, I find it's fun at least to try to phenomenologically approach this kind of thing. Ask yourself, well, how do I know this? What's happening in my body, for example, that tells me I'm in the presence of someone who is in charge, And I don't know how it is with you, but with me it's a slight straightening up. So not quite coming to attention, but there's an aspect of that straightening up. I don't know, maybe I was educated in a particular way that isn't common today, but some of us anyway were like that, and we, in the presence of important people, we straightened up. I went to boarding school where we called the masters sir, and then I went into the army where we called, God knows everybody sir. So that I was educated broadly across this horizon. But I'm sure that the world hasn't changed altogether that way. Now the larger instance of patients overwhelming therapists turns around the experience of psychosis. And I feel myself that what follows has been for me a very helpful idea. I know you may already know it, but to me it's been a very, very helpful idea. And that is that when I'm in the presence of someone who is emerging as psychotic, someone who is disorganized, removed, erratic, my experience is, of course, fear to some extent. That's common. But it's fear mixed with uncertainty, confusion. And those two experiences provoke, in me anyway, but I think I've observed in other people, certain kinds of stereotype reactions. For example, control, naming, a desire to get rid of the person, medication, hospitalization, all kinds of things of that kind, which I really think are functions of bewilderment, anxious bewilderment. Now, if you look at the history, as I have often done, of the reception of psychosis in the medical community, and the names that have been attached to it over 150, 200 years, if you do that, the words suggest anxious bewilderment. And writers will often, Kreplin did this a lot, for example, and Morell did it, and the great Kalbaum, who was perhaps the greatest of the descriptive psychiatrists in my experience, did this too. They are searching for the name that will somehow encompass this person, this bewildering person in front of them. Bizarre, for example, is a common one that appears, incomprehensible over and over and again. But I think that experience is overwhelming for the therapist and provokes defensive and frightened responses. And my point is a simple one, well, perhaps obvious to you already. My point is that if you can recognize that and then sit tight, if you can just not get overwhelmed by that, wonderful things happen. quite wonderful things happen. If you can just sit there, and sort of try to look a little confident and realize it will pass. What's the old Roman saying? This too will pass. The way you have to do with children in their different phases, or yourself for that matter. This too will pass. That a great deal of that diminishes, and you find yourself often in a relatively comfortable place. Now, that's very difficult to do because we're all trained to think, these people have brain disease, broken brains, that famous book. They have broken brains, they have broken hearts, they have broken lives, and this is should be a source of genuine panic. Now, all those hypotheses are interesting. None of them are very clearly proven, but in fact they of course add to our panic over and over again. And then of course the legal problems also make it worse. Well, I seem to be like this snowfall or this storm, a long time coming to the conclusion. I did want to, in the time I was going to have left in this discussion of overwhelming, I wanted to talk, and this is somewhat repetitious, of course. I want to talk first about a therapist whom I've supervised, who has taught me things about this problem, and then I want to go back to the issue again of how we can learn to recognize the real and close somewhat on that note. But I wanted to mention this therapist because it was so interesting to me, and I don't pretend to understand it, but I want to try to describe it, and maybe you can understand it better than I can from the description. This is a woman who works in one of our most difficult situations with very poor people, violent families, destroyed lives. Many of you do too, and I do to some extent. But her everyday fare of these problems is really extraordinary. And because of these circumstances, of course, she has to work in ways that some people would not like. She has to see children. They have to come to her house sometimes. She has to go to their house. The clinic itself is often in chaos. There are bullet, marks on the doors and the windows. And under those circumstances, you often have to do things you wouldn't want to otherwise have to do. And she was describing not long ago to me a man that she was taking care of who was a father of 8 children, a man who had a very oppressed background, had hardly spoken, I think, till he was 7 or 8 years old. And he had a handicapped wife, and a couple of children were deaf, and there were terrible problems in this situation. Now, she managed, and this is what was so astonishing to me and so impressive to me, she manages to somehow find her way through all that without losing this person, in fact helping him to sort of come out a little bit more. And what seems to me that she does is she's somehow able to keep touch with the fragments of what is real about this man. That she doesn't classify him or the kids or the situation, tempting as it would be and easy as it would be in these situations. But somehow in the interactions that she describes to me with the family members, and particularly with him, there is an element of sort of quiet, sort of contacting and leading what is hardly perceptible, I'm sure would hardly be perceptible to me, of this man's aspirations, wishes, fears. All this she seems to go through with a kind of seismic, what was the right word, a kind of metered accuracy that allows the situation to be diffused. Now, you recall the last thing I said was the suggestion that in dealing with psychotic people, that one try to calm down and not be too bewildered. Well, she is able to go into these and not be bewildered or frightened, but somehow just find her way among the fragments of the reality. And You say, well, that's an impression. Maybe I take her too seriously. Maybe I think too well of her. I don't know. I've seen her in a lot of cases now. And also, this man in particular has come such a distance in a chaotic situation. And once upon a time, his children were frightened of him. And now they come to him in a way that suggests to me that they find that he is able to do for them what she has done for him. And that children are very keenly aware of the reality of our relationships with them. And when I hear that change in his relationship with the children, I think that something very significant must have happened. You remember some time ago I quoted that extraordinary remark by Arthur Schnabel, the pianist, about Mozart, that his work was too simple for children and too difficult for artists. And I think, and my understanding of that was that the children would say about Mozart, oh, of course it's real. Of course we can play. Of course we know what it's all about, in the way that children can recognize the reality of a human being, maybe on a simple level, but they would recognize it. And so that the children's capacity is an important sign. I said this to a friend of mine not long ago, and he said, I have been very struck by how children can comfort each other rapidly, which would support this same thing. And those of you who know the work of Harry Harlow, which was once very much celebrated, on the way in which motherless monkey mothers had difficulty getting pregnant and then difficulty caring for their first child particularly. You know that work. It was very famous. It was very interesting. Some of it's been replicated too. But one of the findings that Harlow had was that the children of motherless monkeys themselves, which had no mothers, who became mothers, motherless monkey mothers, the children of those were remarkably able to help each other. And that in overcoming the syndrome of catatonia, which happened in the adolescence of these motherless monkey children, that in overcoming the syndrome of catatonia that happened often, a good experience with siblings was very often protective. Well, now one would like to be able to learn to do what this worker does. That's what I would like. If someone, will you teach me? I would put my hand up. I want to learn how this is done. How would you learn? How would you teach this? Can you? And we do teach everything. We think we're teaching everything, and I don't know if anybody learns anything, but we teach it. And we all know that efforts to teach psychotherapy have often been a disaster. I mean, if you contrast, for example, one of my favorite examples is the learning program of the very analytic institute from which I graduated. If you will contrast the program of instruction of the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute with Freud's instructions for learning psychoanalysis, you couldn't have a more remarkable extremity of opposites. Freud said you mustn't take notes on the cases, you mustn't discuss them while they're in progress, you must not formulate them, you must avoid all such indications, because the cases that go best from a therapeutic point of view, perhaps not from a scientific point of view, but a therapeutic point of view, those cases are those which catch us all the time by surprise. Well, of course, our instructions the learning program is precisely the opposite. Everything is considered, organized, formulated over and over again, so that anybody comes along and says, we're going to teach you how to do this, watch out. It's like learning art. I don't know what your experience is, but I've had a number of patients who've gone through art school, and it's for the most part been a very traumatic experience, because they'll think they're learning something from some teacher. The teacher will get excited. They begin to insist that they paint like the teacher. Over and over again this happens. So that learning, Cézanne went to the Louvre and painted, tried to copy the old masters. That was as close as he would let himself get to these people. So instruction in artistic matters like this is at best extremely hazardous. I try to tell our supervisors here, and nobody listens much to me, but I say, don't tell the young people anything. Don't tell them anything. Just listen and see what's happening. Let them come along on their own. Because you'll tell them how you do it, and they'll press themselves into that box and may never get out. Well, that may be extreme. That's often the way I feel. But if we are going to try to learn, there are some things we might get, right? Some signs. There's a man very well known in our community. He's a lawyer, and I'll start with him as an example in my own learning process. He's a lawyer, and when I first met him, he came over to Mass Mental to interest himself in some of the work, and he had a gesture, he had a way of moving his hand that when I saw it puzzled me. It didn't seem to me to belong to him. It's what they used to call a neurotic phantom, and it didn't seem to belong to him. And well, we all have affectations. That's nothing new, and there are pieces of us that have been engraved. And he married a famous man's daughter. He was famous for marrying famous men's daughters, and if his example is typical, I don't recommend it. Anyway, he married a famous man's daughter, and at the wedding reception, I met the famous man. And he was a lawyer. He was a famous law teacher, too. And I looked at him and I said, "Now, there's something familiar about that guy." And I remembered this other guy. And he had the same gesture, but for him it seemed natural. So I did an experiment. Being a good scientist, I did an experiment. I know, I think, when I say I know, you know I don't know. That's my way of reassuring myself that a suspicion might be true. But I suspect that the transmissions of these things from one person to another take place most readily in conditions of love. Now, I found out, I remembered after I recalled what the first person had told me, that he had been a student of this man and admired him. So my experiment was, if I mention this man's name to the great man, will the great man light up? Because if the great man lights up, that suggests that confirms the notion of love as the transmitting fluid for the transplantation of gestures, among other things, including AIDS. Well, let's not go into that. And so I said to the great man, I said, "Do you remember so-and-so?" I tried to say it not like that, but more neutrally. And he lit right up. And he's a very sober, proper, impressive person. So when he lights up, it's a real surprise. It's like a 100-watt bulb is going on in his head, and it went on. So I thought, there it is. Now, I mention that because that's obviously fake in the first man. There's the untrue, you can say. That's the sort of touchstone for the untrue. And that's nothing new. The most famous descriptions of those things that I know of are in Wilhelm Reich's book, Character Analysis, where these things are called character armor, and where people are, in Winnicott's later terminology, where false personalities are identified by the armors clinking and clanking and seeming unreal, as opposed to false selves, which are simply the sensible protection the rest of us have against wearing our hearts on our sleeves. Well, those things are identifiable. But now, how does this extraordinary worker find her way through pretend people? Because there are people that, this is getting serious and we got to get out of here. How does this woman find her way through pretend people? Because it is possible to put on a role and not have it clank. Acting is all about that. In fact, great actors can put on a role and make it seem more real than other people. So that it's obvious if we're looking for clanks, that's not going to be good enough in this business. Movie actors are different, aren't they? Movie actors don't put on roles. The most famous movie actors don't put on roles. What the famous movie actors do, for the most part, is to grow into it, so to speak, and they act the same part over and over again. Do you know that? Do you know Cary Grant's famous remark? Cary Grant was very important to me because at a time of impostorship of my own, he looked like somebody I could do that and feel secure with myself. So I was always both an admirer and had curiosity about Cary Grant. And it was interesting. Cary Grant, who was apparently on to himself, and he was a Cockney boy from Nowheresville, like dear old Charlie Chaplin, and he sort of found out that he could do this sort of know-it-all, suave, not immodest character and pull it off. And he said after he said, this is something from his autobiography, by the time he had done this for about 50 years, by the time he had been Cary Grant, been playing Cary Grant for 50 years, day in and day out after a while, of course, by the time he had done that for 50 years, he said, it really felt like me. I love that. I thought that was great. It made me hope, you really did. And now what had happened? Had he sort of grown into the part? Or was it really him to begin with and he had to learn it? I don't know, but there it was. But that shows you how hard it's going to be to know the real. I have a patient who had an extraordinary capacity to seem unreal, a marionette. And as she gradually, as the intense elements of her shone through, she would alternate these roles. But there came a time later when they sort of melded together, and when I couldn't tell what was her and what was not her, and it was very confusing to me, and still is to some extent. So this question about the real is a vexing one, and I'm going to stop in just a moment. But I want to close by saying that first of all, this difficulty shouldn't surprise us, because if Lacan is right, and that ourselves begin to be put in place when we look in the mirror, when we see someone there, and we look in the mirror, and that becomes us. Now that is not us, is it? That is a picture of us, or not even a picture of us, but a picture of us looking at ourselves. If that falsity enters so early and so intensely as that, it's not going to be easy for someone else either to know who we are. That's going to be very difficult. Now, the last thing I want to say is that even though it's going to be very difficult, and it's going to be extremely, changeable in the sense, in our sense of whether we catch it or not, in ourselves or in others, don't you think it's a lot like the other great problem in general medicine and therapy? Physical life and death? I used to be responsible more for physical life than I am now, although not for very long. But I remember taking care of dangerously sick heart patients and not knowing whether life or death was winning out. And whether the arrhythmia was fatal and what I should do, or whether I was killing them myself by the wrong medication. I can remember panic going over me years ago, back in the early or late 40s and early 50s. Well, that feeling of anxiety, of being dangerous, and of not knowing whether I was fostering life or death, or whether life or death was present in front of me, I think that's a lot like our problem right at this point now. Can we recognize life in the patient? Can we do that? And I don't think it's really any simpler, or most important, any less important than the kind of issues I faced when I sat with those cardiac patients and wondered whether they were living or dying. Well, thank you for listening so patiently while you may be dying to get home.